much, folks. As you know, I'm Professor Alan Kuperman from the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Thank you for making the time to meet with us today. We're very interested in your feedback. Let me give you some background on this project. I have taught conflict management, that is, how to stop, prevent civil violence in foreign countries. I've been teaching that to graduate students for 20 years, first at SAIS, that's Johns Hopkins University, and now for the last 16 years at LBJ at the University of Texas at Austin. And my course always examines both the latest scholarly findings and the government's latest guidance documents for officials on conflict management. And each time the students and I notice a disconnect. And what I mean by that is that the government guidance generally does not tell US officials how to formulate policies to address current conflicts based on state-of-the-art academic insights. And similar problems have been noticed by other experts in and outside government, who have recommended, therefore, to expand and improve the guidance that's provided to US officials. And I'll give you two examples. In 2019, the think tank CSIS, I'm sure you know them, urged, quote, moving this from a boutique issue to a core cross-cutting issue, unquote. And then more recently, just a few months ago, the US government produced a thing called a strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability. And in that document, it pledged to, quote, expand training and tools for US diplomats engaging in fragile countries and regions, unquote. So in light of this problem that we recognize, others have recognized, I organized a year-long research project with 6 grad students who are here with me today to get a better handle on the problem and how to address it. Today, we are going to present our preliminary findings in 3 documents. These are the 3 documents. They're still in draft form. And so the first one is called Insights from Practitioners. And this document is based on interviews that the team conducted with 44 officials at state, USAID, DoD, and contractors about how their work on or in conflict is informed by 2 factors. First of all, the government guidance documents, and second of all, their prior education and training. The second project document is what we call the mini curriculum. And this is proposed for training US officials, either at government educational institutions or via external partners. It comprises 7 modules made up of 40 edited readings, totaling 350 pages. And I have an electronic folder of all of the edited PDFs organized by module. Last of the 3 documents is called Guidebook for Practitioners. And this is a 20-page summary of lessons from the curriculum on how to formulate policy to reduce violent conflict. The guidebook could be used on its own or in conjunction with the curriculum. As I said, we're really eager for your feedback today. The rest of today's presentation by my team of graduate students is divided into 2 parts. First, you'll hear about insights from practitioners, and then you'll hear about the curriculum and guidebook. So let me turn the floor over to Tom Rehnquist. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Kuperman. Olivia, thanks for sharing your screen. Well, thank you too for joining us. So we'll be handling the first half of the presentation in which we discuss our conversations with practitioners from across the government who work in or on conflict. So just an overview of what we'll get into in this portion of the presentation. I'll give a summary of our key findings. Then I will go through the statistics of who we spoke with, in what countries in which they have experience. Olivia will discuss USG guidance documents and explain what those are and how they're used. Jonathan will then go into training of the folks that we spoke with, specifically from academia and from the government. Finally, we'll give our recommendations based on these conversations. So first, just a summary of our key findings overall. Of these USG guidance documents that we spoke about, we didn't find a strong connection between the documents themselves and the development and implementation of foreign policy. We felt the documents often collect data, but are not often fed into what the government is doing in a foreign country. Our second key finding was that interviewees did not find academic experience to be terribly practical in what they were actually doing in the field or in DC. And they also received very little formal training from the USG on conflict. Jonathan will get more into what we mean by that in his section. And finally, there's very little interagency coordination to address foreign civil conflict. This is not for lack of trying. There have been documents that have sprouted up in the past few years to attempt to remedy this. However, we haven't found anything to be particularly successful thus far. So our statistics, I'll run down who we spoke with over the past few weeks. Like Dr. Kuperman said, we had 44 conversations, most of which were with USAID. This was also not for lack of trying. We made a concerted effort to reach out to individuals from across the government who work in or on conflict. However, the folks we did speak with at state, Department of Defense, and contractors, we felt like they were a good sample of the individuals who do work in conflict in those particular agencies. So we feel like we have a solid sample across the government there. The conversations themselves were typically 30 minutes long. Some more talkative guests were closer to an hour. But we typically just spoke about what their experience is with USG guidance documents and what their training has been so far in conflict and their suggestions on the overall process. And here's a sample of the countries that folks who spoke with where they had worked in missions or conducted conflict assessments. So although we spoke with 44 people, that represents dozens of countries across different continents and quite a few different kinds of conflict there. So we felt we also had a good sample of how the government deals with different kinds of conflict. So next, Olivia will discuss USG guidance documents.
All right, thanks, Tom. So our major findings consist of commentary and critiques that we encountered most frequently throughout the interview process on the relative strengths and weaknesses of various USG conflict guidance materials. So first, I'll go over our major findings surrounding individual documents and then discuss our findings on conflict assessments broadly. So first, we found that the conflict assessment framework, or CAF, was mentioned the most frequently throughout the interview process. And we believe this is not just because we interviewed more USAID officials. Next, the Interagency Conflict Assessment Framework, or ICAF, was praised by many of our interviewees for taking a more participatory approach to understanding conflict. In particular, this included things like interviewing locals and trying to gain a more nuanced understanding of what's happening on the ground. However, our sources also indicated this document hasn't been used in several years, particularly due to the challenge of interagency coordination. Our sources also indicated that the ICAF is more diagnostic in nature and doesn't outline policy response options. Next, the Atrocity Assessment Framework is a relatively new addition to the suite of USG conflict guidance materials. And our interviewees generally praise this document for taking a more nuanced understanding of perpetrators, victims, and potential triggers of atrocities. However, our interviewees also noted that this document isn't yet well integrated into the USG response to conflict. And finally, the Stabilization Assistance Review, or STAR, was described by a number of our interviewees as designed to support an interagency response to conflict. And while a number of our sources praised this document for its goal of mobilizing resources across agencies, our interviewees also indicated that its track record in countries where it's been implemented thus far has been mixed. In particular, interviewees indicated that out of the 11 countries where it's been implemented, some have resulted in thoughtful and detailed reports, while others have fulfilled only the minimum requirements needed to complete the report. So next, our findings on conflict assessment broadly. I'll move on to our findings on conflict assessments broadly. But briefly, our conflict assessments are formalized documents created through a systematic process of assessing conflict dynamics. This includes documents like the CAF and the ICAF. Generally, this involves USG officials going out to the field to a foreign mission to collect data and survey the players and dynamics of the conflict, with the ultimate goal of creating a document that outlines the areas of risk and vulnerability, as well as possible areas of resiliency in the conflict. So our first finding was that conflict assessments are not well institutionalized in the US government beyond USAID. While US aid officials that we spoke with reported regularly using the CAF in their work, our interviewees from the State Department reported pretty limited use of conflict assessments, and our conversations with individuals from the Department of Defense revealed that these documents are never used. The State Department in particular emphasized that the policy process is frequently ad hoc in nature, and that conflict assessments are typically only undergone if someone strongly advocates for their use. An additional issue is that unlike USAID and the State Department, the Department of Defense doesn't have an office specifically dedicated to conflict management, which can constrain the agency's ability to assess and respond to conflict, also adding to the challenge of interagency coordination that a number of our interviewees stressed throughout the interview process. Next, our interviewees reported resistance from embassies in conducting conflict assessments and also utilizing the insights gained from conflict assessments. Our interviewees again referred to the ad hoc nature of the policymaking process and noted that embassies tend to prefer their own approaches and strategies to conflict based on their own leadership. Our sources also noted that embassies can face resource constraints and that the time required to conduct conflict assessments can often make them unappealing. Across the board, our interviewees noted that there's limited dedication to conflict as its own discipline within the US government, as well as a pervasive belief that experience in a specific country context is sufficient to address conflict issues. Our interviewees also noted that there's a variety of types of documents and assessments that conflict assessments compete against, including political assessments and country strategies. Our interviewees noted a general lack of clarity on how these materials should be used in relation to one another and under which circumstances each should take priority. And finally, we found that conflict assessments are rarely linked to policy decisions. A number of our interviewees noted this is actually by design, as conflict assessments are intended as more of a diagnostic tool. However, a number of our interviewees note the lack of follow-up and links to strategic solutions to conflict continues to be a problem, and that this is an area for improvement. So next, I'm going to pass off to Jonathan, who will talk about some of our findings on training.
Thanks, Olivia. Except DoD officials, most of our interviewees had at least a master's degree in a conflict-related field. These master's or doctoral programs included International Peace and Conflict Resolution from American University, Conflict Analysis and Resolution from George Mason University, Human Rights from the London School of Economics, and elsewhere. By contrast, DoD interviewees did not pursue as much education in conflict-related fields. Several of the interviewees refer to themselves as self-trained in the conflict. Professional experience was more reliable than academic training for practical guidance. Interviewees generally knew basic concepts about conflict, such as driving factors, including greed, grievance, and identity. However, most respondents claimed their professional and on-the-job experience were far more valuable to their jobs. This may be because their education was more theoretically focused rather than being practically focused. Access and frequency of training on conflict issues varied widely. Interviewees responded that they seldom returned to the classroom for continued education or training during their career. USAID Civil Service employees reported the most satisfaction with opportunities, with trainings being most common amongst state and USAID officials. Their most common training in the field was usually less than 1 day, typically based on using the CAF or the ICAF in the field, which focused on mechanical procedures rather than larger conflict concepts. Foreign Service nationals reported receiving only minimal training on conflict management or assessment, including USAID's Conflict 101 course and the CAF or ICAF training. FSNs have access to a wide variety of curricula, but they said they never felt compelled to take part in any extended education, instead relied on local expertise. USAID and state employees are required to take atrocity prevention training through the Foreign Service Institute. This training focuses on underlying drivers of atrocities and on US bureaucratic procedures rather than how to formulate a policy response to optimize the outcome. USAID through CVP has begun integrating a suite of conflict sensitivity training, emphasizing how US policies can potentially make conflict worse if not executed properly. State Department officials commented that some training can quickly go to style. This includes the early 2010s requirements on spycraft and defensive driving. Lastly, DoD officials reported that conflict-related training is neither required nor readily available to military officers or Pentagon civilians. All DoD interviewees said that due to a department-wide shift towards grand strategy, the Pentagon has reduced training in peace and stability operations. However, the Army War College does offer elective courses on peace and stability operations, which are typically attended by individuals who possess some familiarity with this topic. The course includes 12 sessions focusing on protecting civilians in conflict, including one on the Mass Atrocity Response Operations Manual. Another interviewee said that the pre-deployment training provided to DoD civilians through the Joint Readiness Training Center pays inadequate attention to phases 4 and 5 of military intervention, which is when peacebuilding would occur. That's all I got, and I'm going to send it off to Tom for some recommendations.
Thanks, JR. And yeah, so distill all of that data into 3 main recommendations. The first is simply that the next suite of U.S. government guidance materials, it has to help officials formulate policies to achieve specific objectives based on the underlying drivers of that conflict. What we currently have is a suite of guidance materials that collects data, and there's not a strong connection between the information and what the government should actually be doing based on what's going on in the country. And our second half of our presentation will go in more into the mechanics behind that. And the second recommendation is that training materials on the causes and remedies for foreign conflict has to be provided in a flexible format and to access asynchronously at their convenience. And so this is based on discussions on individuals who are deployed in the field and then didn't really have access to training once they were in a foreign country. We also had stories about folks who worked for the DoD and were in a classroom and then had to be pulled out after 30 minutes because they needed to solve some kind of crisis. So training has to reflect the busy schedules that people who work in and on conflict have. Finally, the government has to increase interagency coordination to address foreign civil conflicts. And we think the best way to do this is just to have more common guidance documents. This has been an effort in recent years with something like the SAR. However, we have not seen these efforts be successful yet. So interagency coordination should be a key emphasis moving forward. So for the second half of our presentation, our Lexi, Tyler, and Tara will discuss our guidance book on conflict.
Thanks, Tom. I'll let Lexi set it up and then we'll get going. Okay. All right. Hi, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. I'm Tara, and Lexi, Tyler, and I spearheaded the creation of a mini curriculum and related guidebook for practitioners. So the curriculum and guidebook, 7 modules, aim to provide government officials with key insights from recent scholarship on the roots of civil war and how foreign policy can reduce or exacerbate violence in fragile countries. To that end, through these materials, we seek to highlight effective strategies and scholarly developments in conflict management, focusing on the 3 life stages of conflict: prevention, mitigation, and peacebuilding. Give actionable guidance to practitioners about low-cost, low-risk conflict management strategies. Emphasize which conflict management tactics are prone to backfire, so practitioners can minimize unintended consequences of interventions. And showcase examples where strategies discussed in the curriculum and guidebook were employed. So as Dr. Kuperman kind of laid out, the mini curriculum comprises 40 edited readings totaling 350 pages, and it's divided into 7 modules: Civil War Roots, Prevention, Constitutional Design, Peace Processes, Peacebuilding, Backfire Risks, and Case Studies. The guidebook, which follows the same module structure, can be used alone or in conjunction with the mini curriculum. We'll briefly cover some of the key points of these 7 guidebook modules in our presentation today. In our first module of the guidebook, we cover the roots of civil wars and obstacles to peace. Ted Robert Gurr famously identified 4 main factors that foster rebellion, which we highlight in the module. First, identity salience, distinct from the country's nationality. Second, grievance based on perceived relative deprivation. Third, mobilization capacity for collective forceful action. And fourth, political opportunity, such as the government being particularly weak. The first factor, identity salience, is lower when populations have cross-cutting cleavages, meaning ethnicity doesn't overlap with economic, religious, and/or geographic divides. Based on recent findings, we know that societies with low levels of cross-cuttingness are 3.5 times more likely to have civil wars than those with maximal cross-cutting ties, as you can see in the graph. Other hypotheses about why civil wars ignite that we cover in the curriculum and guidebook can be traced back to greed. Greed hypotheses posit that people will rebel to increase their wealth and power if they have mobilization capacity and political opportunities. Greed might also become an obstacle to ending wars, as war can make it easier for parties to exploit resources or profit from humanitarian aid. Notably, how civil wars end has also changed over the last quarter century. In the past, the most common outcome for civil wars was victory by one side, and we find that this is still the prevailing view of civil war endings. But victory by one side is now the least common way civil wars end. Due to recent research by Sebastian Merz, we now know that negotiated settlement has surpassed victory, but the most common civil war ending is frozen conflict, with neither negotiated settlement nor victory for one side, as seen in the graph. This leads to greater chances that conflict will reignite. While that may sound like bad news, and while conflict reigniting may be challenging for practitioners, the key takeaway or silver lining here is that these reignited wars actually tend to be far less violent. This is part of a larger downward trend in violence, so long as we do the long-term conflict management necessary to consolidate the peace. In our second module, we explore prevention strategies and types of preventive action. Prevention is potentially the most efficient phase of conflict management, when low-cost action could avert the outbreak or resumption of violence entirely. There are many commonly proposed strategies of prevention, from democracy promotion to military intervention, but we find that many of these strategies pose large risks of backfiring and would require an accurate forecasting model to predict where conflict will happen next. Unfortunately, despite large amounts of time and money being put into creating such models, we find that they're rife with false positives. You can see this illustrated to the right. We found that even Goldstone's model, arguably the most celebrated early warning model, was accurate just 7% of the time. This means such models cannot tell the US government where to narrowly focus acute prevention efforts. By contrast, other effective prevention techniques do exist, which are relatively low cost and low risk, exemplifying the principle of do no harm. We focus on two: supporting nonviolent resistance movements and minimizing misinformation and rumors. Nonviolence, which has grown in recent years, doesn't provoke large-scale retaliatory state violence like violent rebellion does. As you can see in this graphic, nonviolent movements are 1/3 as likely to provoke violence against civilians compared to rebellion. They are a much safer path. Supporting nonviolent movements is a high-yield, low-cost, low-risk option to consider when working to prevent violent conflict, as we explore in the guidebook and curriculum. Violence can also be triggered by rumors of interethnic crimes. So another key prevention tactic we cover in the curriculum and guidebook is countering misinformation or disinformation. Ashutosh Varshney found that regular engagement between different ethnic groups ideally leads to the creation of local interethnic peace committees, which investigate rumors and either dispel them or punish offenders via in-group policing. This lessens desire for retribution. Foreign intervention efforts to investigate rumors have also proven effective, as we will discuss later with the case of South Sudan. And now I'll turn it over to Lexi.
Okay, thank you, Tara. So in Module 3 of both the guidebook and the curriculum, we discuss ways to design political institutions to reduce the risk of intergroup violence. Constitutions in multi-ethnic societies can prevent violent conflict by legitimizing ethnic pluralism or by making ethnicity less politically salient. Our curriculum and guidebook look at two competing strategies. Power sharing, which is probably the more familiar of the two, attempts to promote peace by distributing power among ethnic groups so that each has a political voice and no one group dominates. One example is the 1995 Dayton Agreement, which separated Bosnia into autonomous Serb and Muslim majority regions. These strategies work well to prevent violence in situations with existing conflict or where tensions are high. However, in the long term, they institutionalize and reinforce the ethnic divisions that caused the conflict in the first place. The alternative to power sharing is centripetalism, which tries to promote political cooperation among different ethnicities by giving politicians incentives to appeal to voters of more than one group. This is often done through electoral mechanisms that require successful candidates to pass a certain threshold of votes in multiple regions of the country, including areas where their ethnicity is a minority. Unlike power sharing, centripetalism can reduce the political salience of ethnicity over time. However, because it relies on winner-take-all elections as a mechanism, it can create grievances among electoral losers. We also discuss ways to use these two strategies together. Power sharing is the safer approach during and immediately after a civil war, while centripetalism promotes long-term unity. So it may be useful to use a two-step approach, beginning with power sharing after a peace agreement and introducing centripetal mechanisms later on. In our fourth module, we look at ways third parties can contribute to peace processes through both coercive and non-coercive mediation, and how they can help resolve challenges posed by spoilers after negotiations. Non-coercive mediation does not usually end conflicts on its own, but it is low cost and low risk, and it can help break down barriers to peace. We discuss an interactive problem-solving approach in which the mediator hosts an informal dialogue between influential but unofficial members of the opposing sides, like community leaders, ex-officials, journalists, or academics. These interactions outside official channels can break down negative stereotypes and allow participants to brainstorm solutions, which they can then take back to the leaders on their respective sides. Third parties can also facilitate a domestic peace agreement by coercing combatants to view a negotiated compromise as better than continued fighting. Our guidebook discusses a three-step process for doing this, which we've outlined in this graphic. In this example, there are two parties to conflict, A, which is relatively weaker, and B, which is relatively stronger. So first, the mediator proposes a solution involving mutual compromise. And initially, neither side accepts the peace deal because both A and B think they can achieve more through total victory than they can through negotiation. So next, the mediator offers military assistance to A, which weakens B's position. So now B switches to accepting the deal because peace offers more than it can win on the battlefield. However, A is newly strengthened and still refuses the peace deal. As a result, there's a third step in which the mediator persuades A to accept the deal by threatening to withdraw the initial assistance it gave in the second step. So A realizes that it also has more to gain from peace than from continuing to fight. If done well, this kind of coercive mediation pushes both sides to accept a deal that ends the violence. However, it can also backfire and create more violence. If you coerce one side to surrender a vital interest, they may instead react by committing genocide to eliminate the opposing population. If mediators are not prepared to protect civilians from violence, they should not use coercive mediation. Even when successful, peace negotiations can be threatened by spoilers, who oppose the deal and seek to block its implementation. Individuals and groups become spoilers for multiple reasons, and third-party mediators can apply different strategies to mitigate them. For example, spoilers who fear that their enemies will violate a peace deal can be reassured by a third-party security guarantee, while spoilers seeking material concessions can be dealt with through material rewards for compliance, or with a departing train strategy that portrays the peace deal as inevitable, and the process that spoilers must join to receive its benefits. Lastly, if mediators are confident that spoilers are bluffing and would prefer peace to continued war, threatening to withdraw mediation can also be effective. And now I'm going to hand it over to Tyler for our last three modules.
Thank you, Lexi. So in Module 5, we look at different aspects of the peace-building process. These are the methods used to implement a ceasefire or a peace agreement and prevent a reversion back to conflict. And there are many different options that can be combined to accomplish this. For example, former enemies may still not trust each other even after a peace deal is signed, and therefore they don't fully disarm. And that would be why a third-party guarantor, like the United Nations or a trusted foreign country, can help monitor the implementation of an agreement for all sides by offering transparency in the process that may both deter cheating and provide reassurances that incentivize everyone's compliance. There's also transitional justice, which many think of as just offering amnesty to war criminals, but sometimes this facilitates the prosecution of crimes. And perhaps most strikingly, Priscilla Hayner finds that amnesties have sometimes been retroactively revoked, meaning that through proper sequencing, we don't necessarily have to choose between peace and justice. The guidebook also explores the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, perhaps best well known in the South African context, which can take many forms, collecting victim narratives, providing reparations, trading amnesty for confessions, and so forth. And third, we examine bottom-up peace building. These are the methods that target citizens rather than leaders. This includes local methods where individuals meet to share experiences or solve common problems across group divides. Alternatively, there are nationwide methods which are far more efficient in terms of reach. And one good example of this is the work of the NGO Search for Common Ground, which provides various forms of TV and radio programming in conflict-prone zones. These programs include popular soap operas where the main characters overcome their hatred and fear of former enemies, as well as accurate political reporting that encourages participation in elections and trust in the results. In Module 6, we look at well-intentioned conflict management tools that can backfire when applied inappropriately, as well as some of the risks that may cause an otherwise successful program to falter. This section of our guidebook examines 4 specific types of problems: the influence of propaganda on conflict management, the dangers of granting regional autonomy, and the pitfalls of sanctioning human rights violations too early, or pushing for rapid political and economic liberalization too quickly in societies that are vulnerable to conflict. Propaganda, for example, includes any instance where combatants in a civil war try to trick us into intervening on their side by lying about what's going on in the conflict, like claiming that the government is killing civilians when it's really not. The US and other countries have fallen for this repeatedly, which has ended up getting more people killed, not fewer. And 2 ways to prevent this in the future include avoiding precipitous action and establishing a red team to vet this information before it's acted upon. And on this slide, we illustrate the issue of regional autonomy, which is the #1 policy prescription of many conflict management experts whenever there's a restive group in a country. But Svante Cornell has illustrated how this actually backfires over longer periods of time. Autonomy addresses grievance in the short run, but exacerbates the other factors leading to conflict. In his case study of ethnic groups in the Caucasus, 3 of the 4 who were randomly granted autonomy in the 1920s and 1930s escalated and sought violent secession after the fall of the former Soviet Union, while none of the groups without autonomy did so. And the final 2 categories, human rights violation sanctions and liberalization, are both extremely damaging to the maintenance of peace if applied when a state is vulnerable to an outbreak of violent conflict. Sanctions may be levied in response to coercive measures, for example, but those measures may have legitimate state-building purposes, and the sanctions would cripple the state's economy and weaken its authority. Hasty liberalization, on the other hand, might enable extremist candidates to take political power and would exacerbate economic hardship. In either case, well-intentioned sanctions and premature liberalization can lead to the beginning or resumption of bloody civil wars. And finally, in Module 7, we take a step back and we examine a wide variety of case studies illustrating the concepts of the curriculum and guidebook. These examples encompass a large geographic range from Asia, Europe, Africa, and South America. And just to quickly highlight a few, we look at South Sudan, where an international NGO, the Sentinel Project, enables residents to submit rumors for independent evaluation, helping quash unsubstantiated ones that could fuel violence. In Northern Ireland, the United States was able to assume a mutually trusted third-party guarantor role to facilitate the implementation of the Good Friday Accords, becoming a key part of ending a decades-long conflict. And in Colombia, the lack of third-party oversight allowed the government to break its peace agreement promises to improve infrastructure and security in rebel-held areas, leading in just 3 short years to the remobilization of 2/5 of the rebel forces and causing mass displacement of over 200,000 civilians. In each of the situations described, the presence or absence of the international community directly impacts the likelihood of continued or resumed conflict. So in short, the curriculum and guidebook serve to illustrate key findings on best practices and risks of backfire in the conflict management process with scholarly insights and real-world examples. While the 2 items complement each other, either one can be used independently as part of on-demand learning or as a structured series of lessons. We look forward to your questions and your comments at this time, and thank you so much.